Welcome to the Human Capital Innovations Podcast, your go-to source for personal, professional, and organizational growth and development. We hope you tune in often for all things people management, organizational development and change, organizational leadership, and social impact related. Maximize your personal and organizational potential with Human Capital Innovations Podcast. Welcome to the Human Capital Innovations Podcast. In this HCI podcast episode, I talk with Daralyse Lyons about demystifying diversity and embracing our shared humanity. Daralyse Lyons, welcome to the Human Capital Innovations Podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, Jonathan. It's great to be here.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be with you, and I'm super excited to have a nice conversation around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And today we're going to be talking more about your book, Demystifying Diversity, Embracing Our Shared Humanity, which I think is just a lovely title. I'm really excited to unpack that with you and to learn more about your approach in your book. As we get started, I wanted to share Daralyse's bio with everybody. Daralyse Lyons is a journalist, an actor, and an activist. She has written more than 24 full-length books, a handful of short stories, and countless articles, performed in various plays and in improv comedy shows. She is a member of the National Association of Black Journalists and a summa cum laude graduate of NYU with a double major in English and religious studies and a minor in history. After writing an award-winning children's book, I'm Mixed, about embracing her multi-ethnic heritage, Daralyse found her passion and her purpose educating others about the need to embrace all aspects of themselves. She then went on to create the Demystifying Diversity podcast and to write the book, Demystifying Diversity, Embracing Our Shared Humanity. She works tirelessly as a full-time DE&I expert and inclusivity strategist. What an amazing background. And it's just so lovely to have you back on the podcast. Anything else you would like to share by way of your background and personal context with listeners before we dive on in?
Oh my gosh, yeah. So it's so great to be back. I'm really excited to be here. I think because podcast is an audio journalism, platform, and people can't see me. They might not know that I'm biracial, which I think is an important part of why I do this work and what I bring to this work in terms of my own experiences. My dad is Black, my mom is white. And being able to sort of exist in that space of multiple overlapping identities has allowed me to be comfortable, right, in the space between binaries that I think real diversity, equity, and inclusion work requires us to investigate. So I think that would just be the only thing I would add.
Yeah. Well, that's wonderful. And it's always wonderful to have guests on the podcast who have diverse backgrounds. And I think particularly when we're talking about DE&I stuff, I think it's also important. I feel like I'm an ally. I like to talk about these topics. It's one of the things I'm passionate about, but it's not lost on myself that I'm a white dude. So, sometimes I'm a little hesitant to speak out because I want to, give a platform and voice to others who probably have more of a right to speak up on these sorts of issues. Anyways, it's a pleasure to have you, and I'm excited to explore.
Oh, well, thank you. And, Jonathan, I'm so glad that you brought that up, because I think there are many people who struggle to speak out on behalf of others because of their identities, right? And in your case, you mentioned being a white man and, feeling like, oh, do I really have a right to speak? But I think one of the ways that we're going to be able to change this world of bigotry and discrimination is for people to begin to use their voices within their communities, right? And there are certain communities that you might have access to that I might not have access to, or someone else might not have access to. And so I really would encourage people who are listening to this of all identities to to speak to the people where you have a sphere of influence about this work and why it matters, because there are doors that I'll never be able to get through. And that's, I mean, hopefully one day that will change, but it's never going to change if people of all identities don't speak about the things that really matter.
Yeah, very good point. And I, like you said, I wish we were in a world where access wasn't an issue, where everyone could truly contribute and be heard and have their perspectives appreciated. And we're not there yet. There's still a lot of work that has to be done. And to your point, also, I know so many, like I do try to speak up about these topics, even though sometimes I feel like I'm navigating, in a space that it's a little uncomfortable, but it is important. But I have lots of friends and colleagues, other white men, for example, straight white cisgendered men who are, they're terrified of speaking up because they're convinced they're going to say all the wrong things. They're going to stomp on people inadvertently and just hurt people when their intention is to help. And my answer to that is, I get it. Like sometimes I put my foot in my mouth. I just say the wrong thing. But I'm going to learn, I'm going to grow, I'm going to get better at it. And hopefully I can add my voice and within my sphere of influence, like you said, and hopefully can make a difference.
Yeah, it's funny because I think we're going to talk about the book today and a little bit about the work that I do, but so I am biracial. I'm also a member of the LGBTQ community. I'm bisexual as well, but I don't belong to every community that I engage with and interact with. And as a journalist, especially with the work I do for the Demystifying Diversity podcast and the work I did in preparation for the book, I spoke to many, many people who have identities that lie outside of the realm of my experience or expertise. And it is scary, right? Because it's like, oh my God, I don't know what I don't know. And I'm going into this conversation and from a space of wanting to understand, wanting to be empathetic, but also knowing that I'm going to get it wrong much of the time. And I think for me, like being able to kind of live at the edge of my comfort zone is what enables me to do this work. And it is what enables me to be more effective. And there are things that I said or did, 10 years ago, that were 5 years ago, 3 years ago, last week, right? That I like cringe at today because I've learned as I've continued to move forward. And the only way that I've been able to learn effectively is from these meaningful interactions with people who have different lived experiences than I do. Not from a space of tokenism, but from a space of like, I actually want to be a better human. And for me, that means being part of a more expanded world. And having a deeper understanding. So yeah, I mean, I think there's a mythology that somehow we're going to get all the information and then be able to do the application. But my experience is that we learn from the doing, from the interacting, from stepping outside of our comfort zone, failing, making mistakes. I mean, like if we were riding a bicycle, if I were teaching someone how to ride a bicycle and they fell a couple of times, it wouldn't be like, oh my God, the bicycle is the problem and I'm never going to ride again. It would be, okay, well, what do I need to acquire a better skill set? How do I practice this? And I think it's the same with racial literacy, cultural competency, and all the other elements of DEI. I mean, we want to have a certain level of knowledge before going into these situations, but at a certain point, like we gotta try and practice and fall and get up and try again and just keep doing that until it becomes second nature.
Yeah, well said. And I can't help but reflect on, again, I've been having conversations in this space for a long time, and I do research in this area too. And I can say that where I'm at now is a much better place than I was 10, 15, certainly 20 years ago. I'm better at this now than I was back then. And I do cringe at, some of the things I did with good intentions, but that I did in the past. And so, yeah, just dive on in, do your best, try to learn and grow. My experience is most people within these different communities are also very gracious and understanding. and so, we just got to give it our best go, and that'll make a difference because, I think about my family, for example, a lot of good people, well-intentioned people, very, very, very socially and religiously conservative people, which also brings with it certain perspectives. And so, for many of my family, they're never going to have these conversations unless I have them with them, because they're never in the space where it's going to happen, where someone might kind of push them to challenge their assumptions or their understanding. And so I that's on me. I think I have to bear some responsibility for trying to have those conversations and to do them in a productive way. And that's just one example.
Well, and it's an important example, and I'm glad that you mentioned that, because like in engaging with your family, let's say, for example, there's a foundation, I would assume, of love, right? And respect, and a knowledge base of all the experiences that you've shared over time. And that's going to be a very different conversation than, let's say, someone being confronted on a social media platform, right, for something that they said, or even just interacting with a stranger and having that stranger, get defensive and say something to them about, a word or a comment or a phrase that they used, not knowing that it was insensitive or potentially cruel. And I think sometimes we have these conversations from a space of anger and rage and fear, and that just makes people so defensive. And so I think if anyone's going to be equipped to change hearts and minds, it's family members, it's friends, it's people who actually know the heart of someone who is creating harm, often without realizing it, without knowing it, and who can connect with them at that level and say, like, listen, I know that this is what you're saying that you want, and this is who you are as a person. And when you do this, you might not realize that it is impacting people in this way, and that's a very different conversation than like, I can't believe you said that, and just that, which is just going to make people go into that fight or flight response. So yeah, I mean, I definitely think starting with those we love is important, and it's impactful, and it does begin to change the narrative. And I can't advocate enough for loving people enough to have these conversations with them.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And let's dive into your book here in just a moment. I hope we've certainly talked about diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging on this podcast a lot in the past. I hope everyone listening recognizes and understands why diversity is important, how it helps individuals, how it helps organizations. There's so much research on this. We've talked about it a lot on this podcast. So with that kind of, I'm assuming we're building on that foundation of an understanding of the positive outcomes. Why is DE&I work important to you? Why did you write this book? We'll start there, and then we can start to go into and unpack your book a little bit.
Yeah, sure. So when I began working in the DEI space, I really had a personal attachment to it because of my upbringing, because I wasn't seeing a lot of people who are biracial, such as myself, claiming that, right? Or like being able to talk about the richness of that experience, or the issues that come with that experience for some people. And so I started doing work on race and looking at some of the systemic roots of racism. At that same time, I was also doing work interviewing Holocaust survivors and doing work with individuals with disabilities. And I realized that systems of oppression and suppression, and I also have a background, I'm in recovery many years from an eating disorder. And so I realized that there's a lot of different things that systemic issues that really place people in positions to be harmed, to be wounded, to be victimized. And so I wanted to do something that was bigger than just me, right? And so my business partner at the time and we got together and we formed the Demystifying Diversity podcast. And I started interviewing all these people. I think I did 128 interviews for season 1, and about a wide range of topics pertaining to diversity, equity, and inclusion.
I'm excited to announce the publication of my new book from HCI Press, Bluer Than Indigo Leadership: The Journey of Becoming a Truly Remarkable Leader. Early in my adult life, I learned about an Asian proverb that translates as bluer than indigo. If you think about the color indigo, it is a brilliant, deep, and vibrant blue, what some would call the bluest of blues. To have something that is bluer than indigo is rare and truly remarkable. Contrary to popular myth, there is no one-size-fits-all or cookie-cutter approach to effective leadership. There's no silver bullet, no secret sauce, no go-to model that will solve all of our problems. The truth is, great leaders have all had their unique strengths and flaws, and have all had to discover and then pave their own distinctive path in their life's journey to fulfill their leadership potential. Bluer Than Indigo Leadership will help you discover your own path and explore those ordinary, everyday actions that will help you respond to an uncertain future and produce extraordinary results for individuals, teams, and organizations.
As we were doing the podcast, as I was listening to all these voices, I just realized, there are so many stories that I'm not going to have time to do justice to in the podcast. And the podcast piece is wonderful in that it's informative and it brings, these diverse voices to listeners, but there's also a missing piece between information and application. And so I wrote the book because I wanted people to be able to really get more in depth than we were able to provide on the podcast. And also, there's an accompanying workbook that you can buy with Demystifying Diversity, Embracing Our Shared Humanity, which gives readers the ability to really practice these skills, right? Because you get information and it's like, okay, great. Now I know better, but then how do I do better? What do I say without putting my foot in my mouth? Like how do I engage? How do I expand my circle of friends without seeming to tokenize people or without sort of, calling every person of a certain identity I know and being like, tell me everything about what it is to grow up, Black or larger bodied or Asian or, whatever the demographic is. And so it felt really important for me to write the book so that I was giving people something that they could use to navigate. And the other piece to it, why I thought it was important to write Demystifying Diversity, Embracing Our Shared Humanity, is that there is so much incredible work. There are incredible books out there, just incredible work by people far more talented and thoughtful than I am and brilliant. But most of that work tends to be focused on a specific identity marker or experience, right? Like it tends to be very narrow. And I wanted to create something that was a microcosm of the macrocosm. So I wanted to create a book about diversity that was in and of itself diverse. So when you pick up my book, you're not just reading about race or culture or gender, right? Like you're getting an exposure to a lot of different possible identities and experiences, a lot of different voices. And I think that's a realm where there's not enough in this space that really teaches people how to take a view of diversity that is in and of itself diverse and doesn't get so hyper-focused that it misses that these are all interrelated systems and we have to sort of combat all of them in order to liberate people of all identities.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that you shared that. I was actually just in another DE&I conversation earlier this morning where we were talking about kind of the layers of diversity. Some people talk about the diversity wheel and concentric circles, and the more obvious visual forms of diversity versus, you go out into these concentric circles and you get deeper and deeper into who the person is. But there's still lots of diverse elements there. And it's super important for us to consider all of those aspects and not just get stuck on some of those outward manifestations of different diverse backgrounds. Maybe can you speak to that a little bit more? Because it seems like that's an approach that you're taking in your book.
Yeah, absolutely. And I frame it a lot as visible and invisible diversity. Like, for example, neurodiversity is one that people might overlook, right? They might not recognize that someone learns differently, or perhaps has a disability, or, because it doesn't show up to the viewer, to the outside observer. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the person who's experiencing it isn't experiencing what they're experiencing, right? And doesn't have their own rich history and background connected with the ways that they show up in the world. So I think that, to me, I see it a little bit as like subject and object, right? Like we sometimes objectify people and create these narratives about what we think they've been through or who we think they are based on what we can see. And it's very human to do that, but it misses out on the richness of a person. And I'll just share an example from my own life, right? So people make a lot of assumptions about me based on my racial background, about things that I've experienced and like how it must have been for me. And it doesn't actually sync up with my lived experience, And I know many, many, many people who have, that is what the gist of our conversation is. When we sit down and I interview them, they will say to me, I am blank identity, fill in the blank here. And people assume because of that I am, and they'll list all the things that people assume, and they'll say, and the reality is, this is who I am. And then they'll tell me an entirely different narrative about who they are and how they show up in the world. And I think we miss out on who people really are when we project our assumptions and our biases onto them. And the only way to dismantle that is to get to know people for who they are. And that can't happen if we live in these little silos of communities where we're interacting only with people who look like we do, who've been to the same schools, who, have the same experience. So we have to like widen our exposure in meaningful ways, not just scrolling through Instagram and seeing photos of people, but like meaningful interactions. And that's where we realize, I think that's where I've realized, like, oh my gosh, we all have the same feelings. We all suffer from shame. We all have hope. We all have joy. We all love the people that we love and want the best for them. We all want to, have our basic survival needs met. Like we're not fundamentally different, and yet at the same time our differences matter. And so how do we live in that dichotomy and hold that dichotomy and create that space for people? So I think that was a very long answer to your question, but I could stand on my soapbox and talk about this for hours. Hopefully some of that made sense.
Yeah, well, and I think you raise a really important point about projecting. I suppose that's human nature. We all do it, despite our best intentions. And you're right. The only way to stop is to recognize we're doing it and to just listen, to just get to know the people that you're interacting with, and to just stop assuming that you know or understand until you've just like been with them and listened. Active listening, not like listening with an agenda of like, I need to be able to check the box that I now have, a friend in this category, in this category, in this category. And sometimes it's so interesting because all of this space can be uncomfortable. And I find even people with good intentions, because of the discomfort, they start to lean on these narratives because they're familiar, right? And so that can ease some of the level of complexity or discomfort that they might feel. And I just say we just got to learn to be comfortable with the discomfort and patient and flexible and to just listen, and that will help us to truly learn.
Well, and even, taking it out of the realm of DEI for a moment and just thinking about listening as a critical skill that can help build relationships and help us connect with people, people in our lives. Like, I don't know, Jonathan, about you, but almost every argument I've ever had has begun with me having a false narrative or about someone else, or someone else having a false narrative about me. I think about in relationships or something, if I'm like mad at someone, it's often not because of what they did. It's because of the motive that I attribute to their action, or because of my interpretation of what it meant that they said something or didn't say something or showed up at a certain time or didn't show up or whatever, and when I enter into dialogues with people that I know and love, right, from a space of, hey, so I'm curious, I noticed that you said you were going to call and that didn't happen. And like, can you just tell me more about that? Or what came up for you? Or did I do something? When I enter into spaces from a humble space of authentic curiosity and wanting to get to know what drives people, I often find out that what I thought was not at all true, and these are people I know, right? And so, and it's crazy to me that, people I know and care deeply about, I can create false narratives about. And so, of course, I'm going to do that about strangers because I don't know them. I don't care deeply about them. There's more layers of resistance to that connection. But I actually have found that working with diverse populations, that getting to know people with whom I have no connection has made me much more effective at the relationships that are already in my life too. And so I think, sometimes people think about these skills as things that only have applications in a DEI context. And that is not true. It's like when we can practice the skill of listening when all of our biases are screaming, right? And it's scary and it's hard. Well, then how much better of a listener am I going to be when I go to have a conversation with someone that I actually do know and care about and have a level of intimacy built in? I mean, it just makes me better at the business of living to do the work that I do. And I think that's true of everyone. It's like, I'm thinking about a college athlete, right? An NCAA Division I college athlete who's just like striving and playing and working super, super hard. And then maybe, I don't know, they go back to like their high school baseball team to play on the field. And it's like, oh my gosh, I got such a skill set that this is now easy. And so I think that is true of the DEI space as well, that if we're willing to do this when the stakes are high and it matters and it's hard, we get so much better when the stakes are kind of lower and it's easier. But the other isn't true. You can't like practice for the high school team and then show up and play NCAA baseball.
Yeah, that's right. Well, Daralyse, it has just been a real pleasure talking with you. We could go on and on and on. I do need to let you go and get back to your busy day, but I appreciate all of your insight. I appreciate all of the great wisdom that you shared. Before we close today, I wanted to give you a chance to share with listeners how they can get connected with you, find out more about your work, where they can find your book, and then give us the final word on the topic for today.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are a bazillion places that people can connect with me. I'll give two. My website is daralyselyons.com. That's DARALYSELYONS.com. And then the Demystifying Diversity podcast website is demystifyingdiversitypodcast.com. The Demystifying Diversity podcast is available anywhere people get their podcasts. The book, Demystifying Diversity, Embracing Our Shared Humanity, is available I would say anywhere books are sold, but I think for now you're probably better off going online in COVID days. And I think just my parting words of wisdom, which like no pressure here, right? But my parting words would just be to practice. Like, let's look at this as a practice, maybe even a dance, and have some grace, some self-compassion, and some enthusiasm for it, because I don't think that there's any way to get from where we are to where we need and want to be without having really practiced this skill set.
Yeah, I completely agree. Thank you so much for joining us. I encourage listeners to reach out, to get connected, check out Daralyse's book, reach out and find out more about what she can do for you. And as always, I hope everyone can stay healthy and safe. I hope you can find meaning and purpose at work each and every day. And I hope you all have a great week. The alchemy of truly remarkable leadership. Ordinary, everyday actions that produce extraordinary results.
Consider how the nature of work has shifted over the past 50 years. With increased globalization, rapid technological advancement, and the shift in economic composition, the average job of today looks very different than the average job of 50 years ago. What will the jobs and organizations of tomorrow look like? Moreover, what does this all mean for organizational leaders? What are the core competencies and capabilities of organizations and their leadership that are prepared for continued disruption and geopolitical and socioeconomic shifts? Regardless of what the future holds, increasingly, leaders need to be socially minded, data-driven, decisive, champions of talent, and disruptors of the traditional notions of leadership, teams, organizations, and work. The alchemy of truly remarkable leadership will help you to explore your own leadership competencies and capabilities and consider ways to apply and implement them into your workplace and personal life. Check out Human Capital Innovations magazine, Human Capital Leadership. Human Capital Leadership is a free, interactive e-magazine with the mission to help individuals, leaders, and organizations find innovative approaches to maximize their human capital potential. We publish issues quarterly in August, November, February, and May. Take a look at the latest issue and let us know what you think. Thanks again for joining us for this episode of the Human Capital Innovations Podcast. I hope you stay healthy and safe and that you have a great week.